October 28th, 2014, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock, and with me back is the full SYN Boldly team. We have Kathleen Royston and Stephen Doss.
Zaha.
On this week's episode, it is that time of year again.
Christmas?
No, better than that. It's time for more Judicial Council results.
It's not better than Christmas.
It is so much better than Christmas, and it's cheaper in the news. Okay, so to have this make any kind of sense, we're going to do this in two waves. We're going to talk about the 5 things relating to inclusion that are very quick and easy to talk about because there's not a whole lot of new information, but we want to cover it. And then we'll talk about Frank Schaefer because I thoroughly believe in burying the lead. See what I did there? So
Ebola. Find out at 11.
Right. So there are, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 cases besides the Frank Schaefer case that came up in front of the Judicial Council. And in each of these, the results are pretty much what we expected, with one slightly interesting twist. So, decision number 1283 basically continues to confirm that annual conferences can make official statements that say they want the discipline to change or that they support the idea of marriage equality becoming a thing. As long, again, with always the caveat, as long as they don't advocate for people to actively break the discipline. That's different. Relating to actively breaking the discipline, decision number 1286 basically says that if you say you're going to break the discipline, you cannot be punished until you actually do it. Yes. Isn't that interesting?
So hypotheticals don't count anymore?
Right. Much like my love life in junior high, what you're hypothetically going to do doesn't matter. It is only what you do.
It's Kathleen, he's a junior high boy. Just thinking about that. Oh, there.
No, I got it.
Okay, got it.
Making that face for the same reason. Anyway.
Okay.
Either way.
R.
Yeah. And then and also there was a holy conferencing that was part of the Baltimore Washington annual conferences meeting.
Friend of the show.
Back in the summer, and they made their decision on resolutions relating to advocating in favor of marriage equality through a process of holy conferencing rather than traditional parliamentary procedure. And the Judicial Council upheld that, they don't care. They don't.
Roberts must be angry.
They don't speak on matters of parliamentary procedure. They, yeah, so they're not worried about that. So to me, the big change here is this idea of it's not just say. So this will come up when we talk about Frank Schaefer too. But it's not what you say you're going to do, or it's not some list that you've signed. It's only when you actually break the discipline. In this case, generally talking about doing a gay marriage, that you can be punished. How do y'all react to this kind of distinction versus what we've been seeing in these discussions up until now?
There's not really been much of a distinction. I mean, I think this cat has its whiskers stuck on a headphone. That's wonderful. SYN Boldly North Cat's whiskers are wonderful. Anyway, it really doesn't change much of anything because it's kind of like that. Unless you see someone doing something, you can't prove that they did it. Kind of like with the resolutions. Unless you see someone that is a practicing same-sex relationship, you can't prove that they are.
And it's interesting you bring that up because that's some of the case law that was used in the Judicial Council's decision on this was case law relating to someone as a practicing homosexual. Again, you need in that case the position's clear. Just being gay, although the way boards of ordained ministry work, they find other reasons that your theology isn't good enough or whatever, as we've seen kind of in our own friends. But that one of the arguments that was used from the Judicial Council is the same thing. It's not just being gay; it's the evidence of being a practicing homosexual that matters, and that's where the judicial procedure should get involved, not in just the existence of a belief or an idea within oneself or a state of being. It's not a state of being that can get you convicted, or can get you brought up on charges that will stand. It is an action. Being always the awkward, being a practicing homosexual, or doing a gay marriage. Those are the actions that can get you, rather than states or intentions or statements that you will. But to y'all, that you don't think that constitutes much of a change?
I would assume it would cut down on some of the witch hunting aspect and the fear of clergy saying,
I am going to step out and say I'm not okay with this. I mean, you can now say that, and now you have full confidence that if someone's like, oh, I'm bringing you up on charges because you said you're going to do this, you can now say, well, you can't do that.
Where it gets awkward, I think this still does not help people going through the ordination process. Right? Because...
Well, you don't really have any kind of protection until you're in full connection anyway. Yeah. I mean,
from what I've seen, and this is from someone who has a bunch of friends that went through the process, but, I haven't been through the process, nor will I ever go through the process, I don't think. God is not calling me to that. Excuse me. But what I've seen is they could just drop you at the drop of a hat until you are
in full connection,
just because they don't like the way your face looks, and then they could say oh, it was bad theology.
Well, in all fairness to our colleagues in ministry, I'm not sure that is that arbitrary.
I mean, that is the nth degree of.
I think if at any point during your first round of board interviews you say I intend to do this, they're going to find something else because you look like a loose cannon.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but I don't think this erects a shield there, because you don't have...
That's what I mean.
The same protections. They can they can drop you because of that.
Yeah.
Because, when you're in your board interviews, it's all about future action, right? And what you will do. Mm. Rather than here, where it's talking about your future actions don't matter, but that's once you're ordained, once you're through that process. But they are wondering, one of the things they're asking themselves is, will you uphold the discipline? In fact, it's one of the ordination questions.
Yeah, I was about to ask is one of those questions is will you uphold the discipline? So you can say yes, and then as soon as they say congratulations, you can say, oh, by the way, I'm not.
Funny story about that. So I think it was Bishop Carcano.
Of course it was. She's awesome. When
she was administering the oath to a newly ordained clergy, she asked the question, will you uphold the discipline? And they all responded yes. And then she commented, we're going to have to look at that because I don't think all of you will, or something to that effect. Being Bishop Carcano, she didn't not let them be ordained, but she kind of stopped herself and went, yeah, you're not really going to do that, are you?
You're not really going to do it.
I thought that was pretty funny. So again, there's just this does create a level of protection from the witch hunting aspect for already ordained clergy. What I would like to see is some sort of protection for the not yet ordained.
They'd have to change the discipline then and take that question out that says, will you uphold the discipline? There's no way around it. You have to say yes, or they won't ordain you.
Right.
Unless that question's gone.
Or or more logically, you change the discipline, right?
Yeah.
Because you do, on some level, you do want, and we've talked about this in other subjects, you want Methodist pastors being Methodist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So much of what we run into is Methodist pastors not being Methodist. They're being Baptist, or they're being whatever. They're not holding true to who we are. And so to a certain extent, you want this idea that they'll uphold the discipline, or what value is the discipline. And we could debate, but what value is the discipline if you don't have people upholding it? what needs to change is not that we are to uphold the discipline as ministers, but that the discipline itself needs to change, which gets to the kind of aspirational aspects and all of that. Any other thoughts on this or the continuing ability to be aspirational? No? Okay, now for the interesting part. Frank Schaefer. So we've actually...
Friend of the show.
Yeah, sort of. I met him once. I have a picture with him,
I'm Facebook friends of the show with him, so that's good.
So there's something there. So it may seem weird, but we've been talking about this case for a year now. We've been doing this show for slightly over a year, and it was November 18th and 19th of last year that was all going on. And so we're coming up on, 11 months a year ago. And the case is pretty much finally resolved. As we've talked about on previous episodes, there was an appeal back in July where he was reinstated. The appeal said that, look, this punishment that y'all cooked up is wackadoo, and you can't be
I believe
wackadoo.
That was the legalese they used,
The legalese
yes.
was wackadoo. And you can't come up with this wackadoo punishment. You said he needed to serve a 30-day suspension. He served it. We're over. This is done. Naturally, the East Pennsylvania Annual Conference appealed this to the Judicial Council. And they were like, hey, we have all of these questions about the appeals process. First of all, was he even able to appeal because he didn't voluntarily hand over his credentials when he was asked to? The Judicial Council went, no, he could appeal. You never said he had to voluntarily hand over his credentials. You should have written it in if you wanted it to be voluntary. He didn't.
Technicality.
So the next question is, can the appeals court change the punishment that was issued by the trial court? Shouldn't they have sent it back to the trial court? Turns out they had two options. They could have sent it back to the trial court, or they could have set a new punishment for themselves. And so that was totally in order. That was upheld. The big question became, what about the punishment itself? Shouldn't that punishment from the trial court stood up? And basically the Judicial Council confirmed what the appeals court said and said, no, this punishment that you cooked up is wackadoo. Partly because it's looking again to future action. Right? What will you do? Yep. You can only get punished for what you've done. You can't... So the language the Judicial Council uses is basically that they mixed and matched punishments. If they had taken away his credentials, they could have set up criteria for him to be able to get his credentials back. But they never took away his credentials until after, in that 30-day period. They never took away his credentials. So it couldn't be about earning his credentials back because they weren't taken away immediately. Instead, they kicked the can down the road and put it on the Board of Ordained Ministry. And since they decided to pick a punishment from people who haven't lost their credentials and to keep them, the idea of a suspension, then that punishment was served and it can't be about future action. The way I described it in the pre-show is basically the Eastern Pennsylvania court was like the Bond villain who created the really elaborate trap for James Bond.
I'm thinking about the shark.
The shark tank, right?
With laser beams.
With laser beams, when they probably should have just shot Bond in the head, right? If the Eastern Pennsylvania
we are not advocating that the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference use firing squads. Thank you.
Right. But you know what I mean. That if they wanted to defrock him, they should have defrocked him. But they didn't. They created a mechanism that tried to make it look like he was going to defrock himself, and in doing so, the Judicial Council fully recognized that probably what they wanted to do was defrock Frank Schaefer. But they didn't do that. They tried to make it a better PR spin, and in making it so complicated, they lost what they wanted, and so guess what? His reinstatement stands, and he's owed back pay and back benefits.
I think what's interesting, you just said something, if you need to put a PR spin on it and make it that complicated, maybe it's not a good decision. If you are thinking that and you're like, oh, we need to make this look good, if you're worried about looking good, it's time to maybe consider what you're doing in the first place.
Right. No, absolutely. That they kind of knew that this was going to blow up on them because,
right.
they don't want to they don't want the headline to say minister defrocked. They want to create this like weird quasi thing where it's his fault that
you know what
you
did.
You know what you. I just can't say it because
why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself?
Right, exactly. Like they literally tried to turn it into like him hitting himself.
Right.
And then he refused to do that. He was like, "No, I can't uphold the full discipline. No one can, you idiots. And I'm not going to hand over my credentials."
I don't think they counted on him being as brave as he was.
Right. I think
or smart to get in with like I'm not going to uphold that part. It's like no one can theoretically uphold
the entire
discipline
because
it contradicts itself.
I believe in the whole of Scripture. Like,
exactly. Bible says it, so I believe it. No.
Right, but what does the Bible say about it? Right, and I think some of it is, it's hard to know how intentional all of this was on his part. Right, so like. Obviously, he's a very strong ally, but I don't think he did his son's wedding in order to stand up to power. I think he did it
because he loves his son.
Because he loves his son. And so, after the trial, he saw an opportunity to stand up to power. Or in the process of the trial, he saw an opportunity to stand up to power. Mm-hmm. Because keep in mind, there's like a 5 or 6 year lag period between the wedding and the trial. The wedding's like 2007. The trial was last year in 2013.
Yeah, is the statute of limitations in the Methodist Church, was it 6 years?
It was like 10 days. It was some.
Yeah, I think you have 6 years to bring someone up on charges on that.
I mean, not to get all sort of theoretical, but isn't exactly how fights for justice often begin? I mean, like, it was a personal. It was like I experienced this. Like
Rosa Parks' feet hurt.
Rosa Parks' feet hurt is the perfect example of that.
That's the reason she didn't get out of the seat, is because her feet hurt.
Right,
not to do anything.
I just didn't really want it wrong. But I mean, I think that's in this, like, it was an act of love out of his son, and then all of a sudden, there was a trial. Right. And so I'm thinking, I think from what I've seen, he's been really smart about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, his own statement of, like, I'm not going to hand in my credential because I realize that I've become a symbol is basically kind of what he said. That I have become a part of this movement. I have people from the LGBTQ community reaching out and saying, no, don't do it. Bishops were telling him, no, don't do it. And so he didn't, and he stood up. And he's now been in this process for a year. And for half of that year, he had his credentials stripped from him. They're back now. He's now back to being the Reverend Frank Schaeffer. But let's be clear here. This isn't a wide scale victory. In that no one challenged his conviction for breaking the discipline. What this has all been about is the Wackadoo the Bond villain elaborate punishment. And so that's got to be the name of the show, right? It's Bond villain elaborate punishment.
Or Wackadoo.
Or Wackadoo Bond villain punishment.
I really do think about the sharks and Austin Powers, the lasers on their head.
Right. I mean, to me, it does seem like the Methodist version of sharks with irate sea bass with friggin' lasers on their heads, right? Like, this is...
that's good.
Yeah, at least they're irate sea bass.
That's right, because I'd forgotten about that. Because
right.
the sharks were in danger.
The sharks,
that's right, they're not even sharks.
They're irate sea bass. They're irate sea bass. God.
Anyway.
But
I'm looking at the DVD right now, actually.
But this is not... In some ways, you married the DVD.
Yeah, so true.
This isn't a wide-scale victory for inclusion. This is a wonderful victory for Frank Schaeffer.
And it's also a good victory for those who were maybe a little afraid to start taking stands.
Right.
Now they can say, yeah, you can say, I fully, if push comes to shove, I might have to break the discipline, and they can't do anything.
But they can. They did. He got a 30-day suspension. And that doesn't mean, at no point does this decision take defrocking off the table. They just didn't do it appropriately, effectively.
It is a technicality of procedure as opposed to like an actual win for.
I mean, Brown v. Board, this is not, right? This is, like you said, there was a procedural technicality. The Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, their jury or whatever, screwed up. And so he got off. Now, hallelujah for that. I don't want to make it sound like I'm really negative that now he has his credentials back. I think he shouldn't have been at risk of losing them in the first place. But had they just said, okay, you're defrocked, he might have appealed, but he probably would have lost that appeal because no one doubts his guilt. And so, looking strictly at the punishment phase, that was always a punishment and remains a punishment that's still on the table.
Yeah. But it's a punishment for what he did, not what he may do.
Right.
And I think that's the big thing is people can now stand up and say, they can't get punished for what they might do, no matter what they say. It's like that. What's that movie? Tom Cruise. He saw crimes and he arrested people for crimes that might happen.
Yes, with the precogs and the screen.
Yeah, it was a
Minority Report.
Minority Report. Yeah, it was a Philip K. Dick book, and now it became a major motion picture.
Time ago.
I don't know when it was.
90s, early 2000s.
I don't know when it was, but anyway, now that's off the table. You can't say, okay, yeah, you seem like someone who may get a little angry at this, so we are gonna just go ahead and give you a 30-day suspension just to put you in your place because you said in that blog post or you said in that thing that if push comes to shove, you might have to perform a same-sex marriage, and otherwise known as a marriage.
I do think that there, in all of this though, there's sort of the official punishment and then there's the unofficial stuff.
Right.
There's like the fear, the bishop sending around statements, and I've heard of this in lots of places, sort of like, just FYI, stay on your guard about this. This is what, so that's something, that there's sort of the official process with all of this, and then there's kind of rhetoric that pastors actually have to hear on a fairly regular basis. So I think that's another piece of it, just to keep in mind. And so there may be protection for sort of official. There's official kind of protection, but not necessarily the on the ground kind.
Well, there's at least, and also thinking about systems of power, right? So if you are a known radical, and you've made it through the commissioning process and the ordination process, if you are a known radical, think about what your appointments are going to be, right? Assuming that your bishops and your DSs are not of the same mind as you, which is something I think about in going to Texas. There are some very powerful players for me that are not of the same mind as I am. What is that going to mean for my future appointments? Am I going to get, are they just going to lock me in, rural South Texas, which, although a valuable field for ministry, is not the field of ministry I feel real called to, because they're, try to keep the radical out of the center. Or are they going to start enough to put me at Bering Road where we can just be all gay and happy? Using those two things as synonyms. So I think you're right to point out that there are dangers apart from this kind of real officialdom, right?
Yeah.
I can, once I finish this long march to ordination, I can, sign on to RMN's list of people who will do gay marriages or whatever, and not have to worry about being brought up on charges simply for signing that list. I mean, the decision about being able to about this future action thing also came out of the Frank Schaeffer case. Someone from the floor of his clergy session called for a judicial ruling on if you could bust someone for just saying they're going to do it.
Yeah.
Which you can't. Which is great, but in some ways the United Methodist Church is really litigious in that we have a judicial council, which is basically a Supreme Court. But we're not really litigious in looking at, you blocked my advancement for unfair reasons.
Right.
We don't have that kind of protection. We can just say, we thought you were really called to this place. There are no people in this church. We thought you were really called to this place, right? All fields are fruitful fields for ministry, yes, but not everyone's called to every field of ministry. But as has happened often in my annual conference, women have ended up have kind of often top out in upper level associates at big churches, rather than becoming the senior pastor of those bigger churches. Or if they do become a standalone pastor, it's in a mid-sized church. Very seldom is it in the bigger churches as a senior pastor. Those kind of things. Can you look at a bishop or your district superintendent and go, "You're blocking my advancement," and bring them up on charges? No, not really. We don't really have a system for that. Or if we do, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's called leave and become a UCC. I mean, that's the system.
Congregationalist, I couldn't do it.
You become a Congregationalist, or you become a whiskey pallian, or you do something else.
I would use the wrong fork.
A Lutheran.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't be able to drink enough. I would just be like, why is so much wine?
I'm not guilty enough to be a Lutheran.
Yeah.
I like life too much.
Right. And
also, I'm not being oppressed by my prince in feudal Germany.
And I'm married, so I can't be Catholic. There's some there's some difficulties. And Catholic on the Catholic front, Kathleen, you're almost completely screwed. You'd have to become a nun.
I know.
Which is
Ouch.
Although
Be a nun too.
I could be a nun. I'd be a sassy nun,
You'd be
like
great.
Whoopi Goldberg in Sister Act.
That's a great movie. I mean, who would do that to Whoopi Goldberg? But it's a great movie, especially the end of Sister Act 2 is just, that'll really change your life.
Oh my gosh, we are losing it.
If we ever had it in the first place.
We had it a little bit, and then it's now time.
Kathleen, you sounded like you had a thought.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I'm just trying to decide how many of my thoughts I want to communicate.
Well, we can take a break and talk a little bit more about Sister Act.
But I think, all of this, as disheartening as it is to see all of this reduced to judicial language, at least right now, it feels, on my more hopeful days, which are not many, admittedly, but on my more hopeful days, it feels like this is a sign of good things still to come. Like there are cracks appearing in all of this. And technicality or not, this is some kind of a victory. Schaefer's reinstatement is some kind of a victory because as I said, I think that the fact that they felt the need to, strap some lasers on some sea bass, was a sign that perhaps people are starting to realize not only is this not culturally popular, but there's kind of a little bit of shame around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right but my only worry with that is what audience are they worried about being judged by, right? If it's the general public, then that still leaves a long road for us to go down. If they're worried about what the rest of the church is going to think, I think then we're really closer to something.
Oh, no, I think it's the general public, but I also think, and this is really probably not okay for me to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is with the United Methodist Church's concern about dwindling numbers, the court of public opinion is increasingly starting to matter. And so it would be nice if everybody on the inside was on board, but I think that the sort of hemorrhaging of bodies and just of members, that was a really awful way to put that. I'm sorry.
Also hemorrhaging, but I mean, the folks are passing on, we're an ancient denomination.
But losing members in a lot of the conversations that I'm hearing in our conference is about renewal and about reaching out to surrounding communities and all of that. And so if that really is the focus of the United Methodist Church in the United States, to be increasingly out of step with where the rest of society is going to be increasingly and visibly problematic.
It's interesting. One of the justifications the appellate court, the appeals court or whatever committee used for not referring it back to the trial court was that would be a public relations nightmare. Yep. That's actually one of their stated, that's not an implied, that was one of their stated purposes is no one wants to deal with, and this is not their language, this is my summary of their language, no one wants to deal with this PR nightmare, let's just settle it ourselves and issue a new punishment. rather than having this go back down for a new trial. Now, it ended up in the Judicial Council, but again, that's a lot less sexy. Like, this has not ended up on HuffPo, or certainly didn't end up right away on HuffPo. But if a retrial for Frank Schaeffer, that would have ended up on New York Times. I mean, all the kind of the circle that we did before. So I think you're onto something in that clearly it's PR from the general public. It's just how much is that going to sway the decision-making body that actually matters?
Yeah,
in terms of change, it may change what punishments are given for conviction. And I think that's a positive, right? If it's just keeps being suspensions, guess what? People are just going to get suspended, right?
Yeah.
And like that, to me, does not sound like a truly fearful punishment. It kind of sucks, but you can even do suspension with pay. I mean, it may not even end up being a financial risk for your family and all that. It's unfortunate that we're even there, but I think you're going to see a lot more suspensions rather than defrockings out of the public opinion. But it's hard to know how much General Conference, as weird a body as it is swayed by the court of public opinion.
Well, and that's the other, but I think with the international character of it, it will not be.
Sure.
And so I think there will be increasing, assuming nothing changes in 2016, that increasingly the United States Methodist, I mean, either it's going to continue to decline and be sort of seen as a really out of touch kind of thing, or it'll kind of be like this open secret that everybody does what they need to do. I mean, like, it'll just...
But I think there's two different reactions to pressure from outside, right? You can adapt or you can bunker in. And I think we're seeing both things happen in the United States. Some of us in the progressive end are going, yeah, no, theologically this makes sense, let's do this. But then we have a good chunk within the United States church, in a very organized fashion, are bunkering in. And they're really good at political organization in a way that the progressive side hasn't always been. And has not historically been. And there's a...
I'm just saying Northern Virginia.
Sure. I mean, you do have, even within the Southeast jurisdiction, you do have voices that kind of counter the North Georgias of the world. But
you're not wrong.
Confessing and Good News are really good organizers and have a very strong alliance with some of the essential conferences, as much as I hate that term, it's the official term for what they are, that very successfully creates a bunkering in. And that's certainly what we saw in 2012. That is absolutely what we saw.
No, and I know that, but I think at least in a lot of annual conferences, mine included, the discussion has centered on making disciples for the transformation of the world, which, as it turns out, is also the mission statement of the church. And so the rhetoric that I have heard is that there is a lot of support for reaching out,
Right.
And recognizing that demographics are changing and people are increasingly cut off from church. I mean, there's like I just feel like there's a lot of energy around that, at least from where I am.
And we hear that rhetoric too, but that rhetoric is totally disengaged from the arguments about inclusion. It's talking about it's about talking about making more East Side UMCs of the world, and that's where it's looking for more hipster churches without changing the discipline. At least here, you know, I can't speak to any other annual conference, but here, we are talking about renewal, and when we're not busy patting ourselves on the back for things we didn't earn. That's my comment. I had annual conference got recalled. I had to go back to Athens, Georgia, and sit on my butt for 5 hours on Saturday.
Got recalled?
To rearrange some deck chairs. About Simpson. It was bad.
Lord.
So there is a lot of talk about renewal, and call to action in General Conference 2012 was all about renewal, but that was totally divorced from this. To me, a big part of what's hurting any renewal effort is this kind of active movement of exclusion.
Well, and what do you do when you say you want young people and your denomination officially and publicly holds a stance that is contrary to what 80% of people under the age of 30 believe? Like, you are out of step with how things are.
Yes. But you and I would both agree that sometimes church needs to be out of step with culture.
Well, yes, exactly.
But again, that's my point is the same logic we use about militarization and flags in churches is the argument that Confessing Good News is using here, that American culture is out of step with God.
Right.
And that we shouldn't give in to that. It's actually the key logic of the bunkering in is the same thing that I would say, that we even joke about flags and the military and onward Christian soldiers and the battle hymn of the Republic, all of that contained within our hymnal, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it's those same kind of problems where we see that as having given too much into culture, but here we see that culture is unfortunately ahead of us in the wave of God's justice.
Well, my opinion on that is there's one simple question that you can ask yourself to make sure if you are doing what God wants or if culture is too influential. And that is, as Kathleen pushes my head towards here,
I want the internet to see you.
are you on the side of love? That's it. Is shooting someone because they live in a country that begins with an I and isn't Ireland or Israel? Is that showing love? No.
No.
Is killing a family because their house just happens to look very similar to a house that you wanted to blow up and it was in the same neighborhood and you used a drone, you didn't have to actually go in there? That
is, by the way, the
showing?
standard evidentiary practice is it looked kind of right, we don't know who we killed.
Exactly.
That's actually my love language.
Well then, okay. So for Kathleen, that is Holy Spirit rather than militarism.
Sorry,
Yep.
Internet.
Gonna
Sorry,
need a
Jesus.
mighty wind.
Is celebrating the love of two people who found each other and who want to raise a child in a household of faith and a household of love, and that understand that God is with them even when the church says no, God's not. Is that showing love? I'm gonna say what?
No,
What?
because it's not keeping them out of hell.
Okay.
Right,
well,
right,
Kathleen
right.
says no because hell. I'm gonna say
Okay, that was really facetious, but I mean, I think that, and we've talked about this. We've all talked about this, but that I think for certain people, they think they are acting out of love because it is.
Right.
There's this confusion between love and fear.
Mm-hmm. And also, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, that's great, but all have sinned and fallen short. Your pastor is sinned before, depending on what your definition of sin is, and some people think sin is a list of things in the Bible, and so your pastor has sinned before, your parents have sinned before, you have sinned before.
I'm wearing mixed fibers right now.
Yeah, so am I. I'm wearing a lot of fiber.
I know. I only paid my slave 39 shekels. So when I murdered him, it was I just couldn't do it.
Yeah,
That's a sin.
But the murdering really wasn't the big deal.
No, it was not paying
It's
for
shekel.
the.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, it's one of those. It's like there's no hierarchical definitions of sin. They're all the same. And your pastor, the person that is married, the person that comes and sits by you at church, they've all done something that you would consider to be a sin in your list. And this one isn't any different.
Even if you believe, not that we have said
assuming.
that.
And we've said this
Number of
before.
times.
I just said that's why I added that if you believe this is a hierarchical list of wackadoo.
Yeah. So, we have talked about this ad nauseum for years, and we'll continue to until we can get some change, and then we'll talk about how happy we are about the change.
Or we'll find something else to yell
Or
about.
we'll find something else to yell about. So we probably should get out of
Comic Sans should not be the discipline's font.
here.
That's what we're going to yell about next.
Yeah, great. Of all the things.
That's awesome.
So on that note, we really do need to get out of here. If you have any feedback for us, SYN Boldly, SYN Boldly, at nfear.org, facebook.com/signyourname project, or at SYN Boldly, SYN Boldly, on Twitter. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night.